Good day. Yesterday was, in all respects, apparently a bad day for President Zelensky of Ukraine. Now, I discussed in my program yesterday the nature of President Zelensky's trip to the United States. I made it clear that insofar as it was an attempt to lobby US senators, US political figures to maintain support for the war in Ukraine, for continued funding by the United States of the war in Ukraine, I said that I could see no reason, no logical reason why Republican senators and Republican members of the House of Representatives would change the negative stance to that which they have taken up to this point. I did say that there is always a possibility in politics of the unexpected, but nothing unexpected in the event happened. President Zelensky did all the things that you might expect him to do for somebody who is engaged in a lobbying exercise. He met with the heads of the US arms companies, the military-industrial complex, to try to get them on side, and no doubt to lobby on his behalf with the senators and the Congress people. I discussed how that is done in my program yesterday. He then met with some of the chosen senators at the invitation of Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell, and he had his meeting with House Speaker Mike Johnson. And in every single case, it seems that he drew a blank. From what I understand, the senators were not at all impressed with his presentation. One senator, Eric Schmidt, apparently came away saying that it was the same as what he'd heard many times before. And if you actually listen and read the kind of comments that President Zelensky was indeed making over the course of his trip to Washington, he was indeed saying much the same things as he has said before. So he didn't succeed with the senators, and predictably enough, he didn't succeed with Mike Johnson either. What he managed as a result of his meeting with the arms companies, the chiefs of the arms companies, the military-industrial complex, about that, I have no idea, but it doesn't seem as if it really matters. And then he had a meeting with President Biden, and then there was a press conference, and I have to say that as of the time of making of this video, the White House has not yet published an official transcript of the press conference. But reports, including by CNN, are very interesting, and they do appear to confirm that American financial and military support for Ukraine is waning. Now, according to some reports, President Biden said things like this. This is during the press conference. Without supplemental funding, we are rapidly coming to an end of our ability to help Ukraine respond to urgent operational demands that it has. We will continue to supply Ukraine with critical weapons and equipment as long as we can. And Putin is banking on the United States failing to deliver for Ukraine. We must prove him wrong. But of course, the key words which have been picked up by CNN and others are the words that we will continue to supply Ukraine with critical weapons and equipment as long as we can. And as CNN and others have pointed out, this is a significant retreat from the previous formula, which was as long as it takes. Now it is simply as long as we can. But I think that one can perhaps read a bit too much into this, because one senses that Biden himself here, what he's really trying to do is to try to throw the weight, the blame for the US's inability to continue with funding upon the Republicans, thus his other reported words about the United States not being able to do more without supplemental funding. So I think we can perhaps read too much into these words. Perhaps even more important were some other words that President Biden said, or appears to have said, in which he was asked to define what the United States construed as victory in Ukraine. And a report I've seen quotes him as saying the following: "We want to see Ukraine win the war. As I've said before, a win means Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation that can afford to defend itself today and deter further aggression. That's our objective." Now note that those words make no reference to Ukraine joining NATO or joining the EU, but perhaps more pertinently of all, they don't refer to Ukraine's territorial integrity, to Ukraine reclaiming control of its lost territories. Now, again, I want to add a word of caution until I see a full and complete transcript published by the White House setting out President Biden's exact words. I don't want to put too much weight on all of this. But if it is correct that the United States, according to Biden, sees victory now purely in terms of Ukraine's survival, rather than in its ability to reclaim territory or to join NATO or to join the EU, then that would be consistent with other reports that we are starting to see. And about a day or so ago, there was an article in the New York Times which basically set out what the US's current strategy in Ukraine apparently is going to be. And it seems that the United States is now intent on micromanaging the war even more closely than it has done up to this point. General Christopher Cavoli, who is the top US commander in Europe, has apparently been tasked with supervising Ukraine's conduct of the war. He, in turn, has dispatched Lieutenant General Antonio Aguto to Kiev, where he will be the point man, the US point man. And the plan, apparently, is for Ukraine to conserve its forces, to fight on a tighter budget, to abandon ideas of grandiose offensives, to try to move towards a defensive strategy, with the hope being that by the end of 2024, the Russians will have concluded that Ukraine is too difficult a nut to crack, because the resistance from the Ukrainians is too strong, and the build-up of American weapons and other supplies from what is assumed will be a revived military-industrial complex, that the supply of US weapons will be too great, and that the Russians will at that point agree to sit down with Ukraine to negotiations. Negotiating about what is, of course, not made clear. Now, there's been an awful lot of people who have discussed this article, and Simplicus the thinker thinks that this is all a long-term strategy for the United States to continue the war, to achieve some kind of political outcome, some great military objective. He thinks that even though it is probably the case that the United States is falling short, well short, of its plans to build up its armed forces, to build up its weapons production. Simplikis, the thinker, and others still think that this is basically an attempt to play for time, to try to hold the situation together on the battlefronts until the United States can rev up its military industries and provide Ukraine with the forces, the weapons that it needs, even as Ukraine itself rebuilds its army, shattered as a result of the disastrous summer offensive, and in effect becomes stronger again. I take, I'm afraid, a much more cynical view of this. Going back to what Emma Ashford was saying in that article in The Guardian, it seems to me that the exercise is really far more simple. It is to hold Ukraine together until the presidential election in the United States in November. The Biden administration does not want to see a collapse in Ukraine next year, certainly not before the election itself takes place, and General Cavoli and General Aguta have been instructed to do all within their power to prevent that happening. For the political class in Washington, Democrats, Republicans, members of the Biden administration, and people who are not members of the Biden administration, he who wins the election in November is the single most important thing. And the election itself is prioritized over everything. So, there we go. That's what I think this is all about. An understanding that Ukraine cannot conduct offensives and attempt to get the Ukrainians to hold together, to keep the Russians at bay for just a few more months until the election itself is out of the way and President Biden himself is hopefully re-elected. That, I think, is now the entirety of the plan. I don't think that there is anything more to it than that. And, of course, there might be some hope that the Russians engage in negotiations at the end of 2024, but far more likely the talk about the election, the negotiations at the end of 2024, about the Russians being forced to the negotiating table, is again a device in order to rationalize the existing policy. Nobody wants to say in Washington that it's actually all about the November election, and also perhaps to reassure some Republicans in Congress that behind all of this, behind all of these moves, there actually is some kind of plan, some actual plan that relates to US national interests and to Ukraine itself. So that's my very cynical take of what passes for White House strategy at the moment. I think that obviously it won't have been explained to President Zelensky himself in quite such stark terms. Perhaps he too is being fed the story that this is intended somehow to give Ukraine time to rebuild. Almost certainly some people in Washington will have tried to impress on Zelensky the importance of negotiations, something he has been deeply reluctant himself to engage in, but there we are. Now, according to the same New York Times article, this American plan, unsurprisingly, is coming in for a great deal of resistance in Kiev. It seems that Ukrainian officers and Ukrainian civilian officials don't like it. They don't understand why they're being asked to keep fighting like that, going on the defensive week after week, month after month, right through 2024, having the Russians batter their cities, having their army suffer further attrition on the front lines, because that is what the United States wants them to do. Instead, Ukrainian officials have apparently been asking for enormous quantities of American weapons, millions of shells. We had that fantastic demand from General Zelensky to General Lloyd Austin about a week ago. I discussed it in my programs then, for 17 million shells. Anyway, the Ukrainians are apparently asking for all these shells, these millions of shells to be provided, for huge quantities of weapons to be provided, for vast cornucopia of financial subsidies and for military equipment. And it seems that when the Americans try to explain to the Ukrainians that these stockpiles of weapons that the Ukrainians assume the United States and its allies must possess do not actually exist, the Americans encounter from the Ukrainians disbelief and incredulity. And for the record, we've seen this before. I can remember, for example, after the military victory over Saddam Hussein's forces in Iraq in 2003, Iraqi officials in the newly installed governments simply couldn't quite bring themselves to believe that there was a limit to US resources, that the United States could not supply the indefinite quantity of economic and financial and military assistance that the Iraqis were expecting. And the disillusionment and dismay as that reality began to sink home. And I suspect that the Ukrainians are on the same trajectory. As is the case in many countries, one still encounters people who think in this way. For example, in Greece, and my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has told me that the same is true in Cyprus. There continues to be, in much of the world, a continued belief in America's limitless, supposedly limitless resources and power. And of course, it's an illusion that the United States itself has on many occasions fostered. President Biden did it himself just a few weeks ago. He was asked whether the United States could indeed afford to sustain the wars in Israel and Ukraine at the same time. And he said, yes, of course we can. We are the United States. Of course we can do it. We did it during the Second World War, presumably. So, of course, we can do it now. And the trouble with that kind of rhetoric is that from time to time, people do take it at its word. And it does seem as if some people, at least in Ukraine, have been doing precisely that. And they are now astonished that, in fact, things have turned out otherwise from what they believed, that American power is not limitless, American resources are not limitless, American taxpayers are concerned about what is happening to America's tax dollars. American Congress people worry about the fact that US reserves are becoming overextended, and over and above and beyond that, some American Congress people and American senators are, understandably enough, not only exasperated by these unlimited demands from the Ukrainians, but are becoming put off by the colossal sense of entitlement that some Ukrainian officials, including President Zelensky himself, routinely exhibit. Well, there it is. I suspect that at some point over the next few months, we're going to see a major fracturing between the US and Ukraine, very much, by the way, as we saw between the US and the leadership of South Vietnam in the 1970s, when the South Vietnamese also began to understand that America did not have infinite power and infinite resources and had no option but to start looking to cut deals with the North Vietnamese and beyond that with the Chinese and the Russians. The South Vietnamese began to become extremely disillusioned and angry and started to talk about betrayal. And we are probably before long going to see similar tensions between Ukraine and the United States, and a similar betrayal narrative in Ukraine take hold. And unfortunately, one can also see that there are some people in the United States and in Europe, people of neocon persuasions, who are going to work hard to foster that betrayal narrative. There's already a widespread claim, you find it everywhere, every day, in article after article in the Western media, published by various neocon people, that the reason that Ukraine has not achieved its great victory is because of the supposed reluctance of the Biden administration to supply Ukraine with all the weapons that it needed and wanted in a timely fashion. Never mind about supply constraints, logistical problems, lack of equipment for the US military, shortages within European militaries, time needed to train Ukrainian soldiers, all those things that people like Brian Beletic have been talking about now for the better part of 2 years. Ignore all of that. Just assume that the United States had the ability to supply Ukraine with everything that it wanted and asked for, and criticize the government of the United States, President Biden in particular, for their failure to do so. Anyway, there we are. A disappointing trip for President Zelensky in Washington. It now looks all but impossible, and Mitch McConnell himself said that, all but impossible for Congress to authorize a further financial package for Ukraine before the end of the year, before the Congress rises on Friday. That now seems to be a possibility that no longer exists. So the earliest, realistically, that Congress can return to this subject is February. And of course, by that point, the political calendar will become even further dominated by the pending election, and quite possibly by the impeachment inquiry that Speaker Johnson is intending to launch today. So it's far from certain that come February, Congress will agree to do that which it has refused to do this month, which is authorized more financial aid for Ukraine. In which case, the Ukraine project, will indeed be, to all intents and purposes, at an end. Now, Ukraine is still getting some funds. President Biden has said that there is still a small amount of money left from the previous appropriations. He's just authorized $200 million worth of weapons to be supplied to Ukraine. This is left over from the previous appropriation. There's lots of uncertainty as to how much money is left. And of course, we've seen in the past that the administration, through various clever accounting tricks, has always been able to find some means to dredge up more money. And we shouldn't exclude that possibility. Some reports suggest it's up to $3 billion. Others say that it's less than that, less than $2 billion. I'm not going to waste time trying to speculate about this. But Ukraine will still get some dribbles of money and weapons from the United States. It will continue to get some dribbles of money and weapons from Europe. To be precise, money now principally from the Germans, so far as I can understand, despite the fact that Germany is now in a deep financial crisis. And it will also get weapons from Germany as well, even though the political situation in Germany is now careering towards a crisis. And I'm going to discuss that briefly later in this program. Ukraine, incredibly, is still able to get funding from the two big international institutions, from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The International Monetary Fund has just authorized a $1 billion loan to Ukraine. This on top of the enormous amount of financial support the IMF has been sending to Ukraine ever since the Maidan events of February 2014. Now, it cannot be said too strongly that the IMF, in doing this, is putting its loyalty to the collective West above its supposed responsibilities as a financial institution. Given the realities of Ukraine's economy at the present time, Ukraine ought to be the last country in the world that the IMF should be continuing to lend money to. But they're doing this. They continue to do this. Back in 2015, they sent financial packages to Ukraine, despite the fact that Ukraine defaulted on repayment of its loan to Russia, $3 billion loan to Russia. The IMF looked the other way, disregarding its own rules, which said that a country like Ukraine could not access IMF funding if it defaulted on loan repayments to a member of the Paris Club, which Russia, by the way, is. Anyway, nonetheless, the IMF continued to provide funding. They continue to provide funding thereafter, even as Ukraine's underlying economic situation continued to deteriorate. They've now continued to provide funding even as Ukraine is caught up in a war, and they've continued to provide funding even as the United States itself has decided that it will not for the moment provide financial assistance to Ukraine, creating a real possibility that Ukraine may soon find itself in a situation of economic crisis and, as I discussed in a recent program, potentially in a situation of hyperinflation. If anyone has had any doubts that the IMF fulfills principally American geopolitical objectives and has been doing so for many years, and that it is not the pure technocratic organization that it pretends to be, then the conduct of the IMF towards Ukraine provides the final proof on this issue. Anyway, I'm not going to spend more time about this. $1 billion, which is a loan, by the way, not an outright gift, $1 billion from the IMF. It will help, but it will not replace the massive hole that a withdrawal of American assistance, direct American assistance, will create. And of course, European assistance is now in question also, given that Hungary and Slovakia have made clear their opposition. So $1 billion, hardly enough to keep Ukraine going for more than a few weeks. That money will very quickly run out, at which point the problems will become even worse than they would be if this funding had not been supplied. But anyway, that's the net result of President Zelensky's visit. He didn't get the funding from Congress that he perhaps hoped he would, and he's been given almost certainly news from the administration that he didn't want to hear, that there's no guarantee that American funding will be provided in future, and that the United States no longer believes in Ukraine's military victory. The entire objective now is to hold things together in Ukraine for as long as possible by placing Ukraine on the defensive. The rationale is to try to get the Russians to the negotiating table, something which Zelensky himself, by the way, has consistently shown that he opposes. But the reality, as Zelensky must at some level know, is to get Joe Biden elected president in November without the risk to his re-election of a Ukrainian debacle in the preceding months. So, President Zelensky, very unhappy about the situation in Washington. From his point of view, an unsuccessful trip. The military news is continuing to get worse. And as I said in my program yesterday, it is getting worse at an accelerating rate. Now, always there is uncertainty as to exactly what is going on, but the trend of events is very clear. Firstly, yesterday, our old friend Vladimir Rogov, who is, well, not exactly an official, but he is an important person in Zaporozhye, political figure in Zaporozhye, the Russian-controlled part of Zaporozhye, I should make clear. Anyway, yesterday, Vladimir Rogov said that the Russians have achieved full control over Marinka. And in fact, we got pictures of Russian soldiers raising their flag over an area of Marinka, which had been one of the few last remaining pockets of Ukrainian resistance. It seems that Vladimir Rogov might be a little premature. There are apparently some areas, not so much on the outskirts of Marinka itself. From what I can see, again, bear in mind, I'm not the best person. to read maps. But from what I can see, these are places, built up places, some distance from the main residential areas of Marinka, which are indeed now fully under Russian control, some outlying areas where the Ukrainians still maintain a presence. Dima at the Military Summary Channel has estimated that 98% of Marinka is now fully under Russian control, and he speculated that the Russians might not even be interested in capturing these outlying areas. He suggested that the major priority for the Russians would be to push south from Marinka towards Novo-Mikhailovo, this village which the Russians have been attacking, which is to the south of Marinka. They have encircled it on three sides, and they seem to be pushing their forces closer and closer to Novo-Mikhailovka. I don't entirely understand this battle, but it's been suggested to me that it is connected in some way to the other battle further to the southwest for the important town of Vuhledar, that if this village, Novo-Mikhailovo, is captured by the Russians, then with Marinka effectively, essentially under Russian control, Ukrainian positions in Vuhledar will start to crumble. Well, I don't know about this, but anyway, I'm just relaying all of this as well. But anyway, Dima suggested that that might be what the Russians might prefer to do rather than to clear up these remaining outlying districts of Marinka. And indeed, this morning, we actually got news that the Russian forces from Marinka are indeed starting to push south towards Novo-Mikhailovka, which is also being attacked by Russian forces advancing northward from the south of this village. In other words, there is a two-pronged attack on this village by the Russians from the north, from Marinka, and from the south. And most people who've been looking at this situation assume that the Russians will capture this village with whatever strategic significance it has before very long. But I ought to say that I have also seen reports earlier today, that even as the Russians have indeed started to push towards Novo-Mikhailovo, there is a Russian advance to the northwest as well to clear the Ukrainians precisely from these outlying settlements close to Marinka, which they still occupy, which would suggest that the Russians do indeed intend to bring the whole of Marinka properly under their control, and that they also intend to attack the defences which the Ukrainians have tried to cobble together to the northwest of this town, and to which the Ukrainian forces in Marinka have fallen back to. So anyway, we'll just have to wait and see what exactly is going on there. But it does seem as if the long battle of Marinka has effectively been brought to a close. Now, in Avdeyevka, the news is, if possible, even worse. It now seems that Russian forces have penetrated into the residential areas of Avdeyevka, both from the south and from the north, and that there is now, in effect, street fighting going on in Avdeyevka itself. Also, it seems that the Russians have gained control of more territory west of the railway around Stepovoye. It seems they still have a presence in the eastern part of that village. And it seems that their bridgehead, as it's been described in this area, is increasing. Well, if so, that is an ominous sign for the Ukrainians, and they're being pushed in Avdeyevka itself, and they're losing their positions apparently west of the railway track also. The attrition there is starting to work in the Russians' favour, and the 47th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian military, which has been putting up such a sustained defence in this area, is being burnt up and is losing its ability, or so it seems, to withstand the Russian advance. And the Russian advance in this area in the northwest of Avdeyevka, beyond the railway track, towards Stepovoye and BRICS. And it turns out that there are also reports that the Russians have now resumed their offensive towards the village of Keramik, which is further to the north. It's not at all clear what exactly the Russians are planning here, but this might be, again, a further part of a further plan to push the Ukrainians further back from Avdeyevka, push the Ukrainian artillery further back from Avdeyevka, even as the Russians further south enter Avdeyevka itself. So, a tough battle still going on in Avdeyevka. Ukrainian soldiers, angry and demoralized perhaps, but still resisting, suffering very heavy losses, but the Russians do seem to be making very significant progress in the Avdeyevka area, and the Ukrainian defences in Avdeyevka appear now to be collapsing, cracking. I don't know how much longer this battle for Avdeyevka can go on for. Probably, my guess is, a couple of weeks. But, as I said previously, the trajectory of travel is absolutely clear. It doesn't seem as if this battle is going to take as long as Bakhmut. For the record, it seems to me that the Russian advance in Avdeyevka, given how heavily fortified Avdeyevka apparently was, that the Russian advance around Avdeyevka has been much faster than I think most people, myself included, expected. So that's the situation in Avdeyevka. And there have been other reports from other places. The Ukrainians apparently now are accepting that that the Russians are literally on the outskirts of Rabotino, in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, that the Ukrainians are being pushed back. There, the place where they conducted their great offensive of the summer, that they're losing ground there. There's also more reports of further Russian advances in the Svatovo-Kremenaya Liman area. The Russians, again, expanding the areas of their control, inflicting heavy losses on the Ukrainians, steadily improving their positions as they presumably prepare for the advance that will not just retake Liman and Kupiansk, which I think must be Russian objectives, but presumably for the ultimate plan, which is to advance beyond the Oskol River. My guess is towards Izium and Balaklia. The place is lost during Ukraine's offensive in autumn 2022. And perhaps with the Russians planning something further once they have regained full control of these territories. And we've now had comments by Vladimir Sladko, the head of the Russian regional government in Kherson region, and he says that his understanding is that there is now definitely a Russian plan to land troops on the west bank of the Dnieper and to recover all of Kherson region, which the Russians retreated from in the autumn of last year. In other words, to recapture the city of Kherson and the remainder of Kherson region. And Sladko seemed to speak about this being a plan that the Russians are preparing for and which will be launched within a relatively short time, though of course he didn't provide any kind of timeline. And I wonder whether this is partly the explanation behind this battle at Krinky, the way in which the Russians have allowed this bridgehead at Krinky to continue, allowing the Ukrainians to send reinforcements to Krinky, which the Russians then destroy pretty much as soon as they arrive. A process that has been going on now for many months, which is that, of course, if the Russians do have some plan to cross the Dnieper themselves and to reoccupy Kherson city and Kherson region, then you could argue perhaps that the Ukrainians are helping them with all of this, because the Ukrainians are burning up in Krinky the men and some of the machines that perhaps they could have used to repel a Russian crossing of the Dnieper to recover Kherson east of the Dnieper. West of the Dnieper, sorry. Well, we'll no doubt find out in due course. Of course, it could be also that the Russians are spreading these stories that they plan to cross the Dnieper and regain control of Kherson region west of the Dnieper in order to keep the Ukrainians unsure and off balance. I understand that a river crossing by the Russians into Kherson region west of the Dnieper would be a very complex operation indeed, especially given that the west bank of the Dnieper is higher than the east bank, which would give the Ukrainians good sight lines and positions for their artillery as the Russians advance. But then again, Russians have been bombing Ukrainian positions all along the lines, all along the heights in Kherson region west of the Dnieper. Perhaps that is indeed their long-term plan. We'll just have to wait and see. So, bad news on the front lines for Ukraine, and bad news in the air, because last night, there was another big Russian drone and missile strike on Ukraine, much of it targeted on Kiev. The Ukrainians claimed that 10 Russian ballistic missiles were launched against Kiev. I'm not sure of what type. The Ukrainians claimed that they shot down all 10 of these missiles, but there's lots and lots of pictures of damage being done across Kiev, big fires in various places. The Ukrainians, or at least Western journalists, say that this is all the result of debris from these falling missiles which were shot down by the Ukrainians. As always, I take these Ukrainian claims of massive success in bringing down Russian missiles with deep skepticism. And I've heard something else, that maybe the Russians did launch some missiles against Kiev, but some of the attacks on Kiev, the attacks which got through, were the work of geranium drones. But these are not the geranium drones that we have been used to, the ones that were based on Iranian patterns. These are the Russian manufactured geranium drones, of which the Russians have worked on and whose effectiveness they have significantly improved. And there's reports that these drones are now painted black, making them even less visible in the night sky, that the components that they're made from, the metal components, have been reduced even further, making them more stealthy and more difficult to be tracked by radar, and that the Russians have installed a turbojet engine, a small turbojet engine, in place of the turboshaft engine, propeller engine, in other words, that the original geraniums had. Now, the Iranians themselves, by the way, have displayed a geranium drone with a small jet engine. And I don't know whether this was a joint project with the Russians, or whether the engine, the jet engine that the Russians have now installed on the geranium drone is the Iranian one that we saw displayed before, or whether the Russians have pursued a parallel program and that this is an entirely Russian development. But it does seem as if the jet engine has had an effect. It means that the drones are now much quieter in the way they operate. They throw up an even smaller radar signature. The propellers do apparently throw up radar signatures. I'm not an expert in these matters. But anyway, that they've successfully done that. And it, of course, means that the drones, the geranium drones, are now very much faster than they were previously. They have evolved, in my opinion, into quite sophisticated, but still rather cheap and simple cruise missiles. Anyway, the Russians claim, or at least Russian telegram channels claim, that it was these drones, which mainly attacked Kiev last night, that they actually got through, and that they've done the damage that we have seen. So, bad news for Zelensky on the political and diplomatic front. His trip to Washington was unsatisfactory and a failure, and rapidly deteriorating news on the battlefields. Now, I want to stress again a point I made yesterday. It's very difficult to convey without spending much more time to discuss military developments, the speed of the deterioration in Ukraine's defenses. If you read and follow and listen to people like Dima at the Military Summary Channel, and you do so every day, as I'm afraid do, then you do get that sense that on Ukraine's part, things are breaking down with every day, every night, that bit faster. It is an accelerating trend towards collapse. Now, there's still a lot of fight in the Ukrainian army, but the soldiers are tired and demoralized. They're short of equipment and shells. They're massively overextended and overstretched. And it's debatable to me how much longer this can continue for. Anyway, that's what I get to say about the state of the war. There are two things I wanted to just touch on. Firstly, I have had a most interesting email from a person who is a former engineer, or at least, well, not a former, he is an engineer. I'm not going to say anything at all that will disclose his identity, except to say that he has been an extremely, he's both an extremely well-informed person and somebody who has provided me with a huge amount of assistance in understanding various items of military equipment, especially those used by the Russians. Though I would say this, he is not actually Russian, but that's the only piece of information about him that I'm going to disclose. Anyway, he made a number of points to me, specifically on the topic of the sanctions and about Russia's military industrial strengths. He said that, to his knowledge, the British embassy in Moscow had almost no understanding at all, hardly any contact with Russian industrial companies, and the United States embassy had a little more, but not very much. They were essentially deeply uninformed. They remain deeply uninformed about the industrial structure of the country, Russia, and of its industrial and technological strengths. And this person has also informed me of something which I am fairly sure is true, which is that when delegations of Russian business people from various industry backgrounds have traveled specifically to the United States and have toured American factories, they have on occasion come back to Russia profoundly shocked by the backwardness and the anachronistic stack quality of some of these American factories that they visited. The old machine tools, the poor work practices, things of that kind. Now, the latter rings true because when I used to do industrial work long ago in Britain, I used to sometimes visit British factories as well. And at that time, and this was a while back, but I don't think things have improved radically since then, I too would be routinely astonished at the age, indeed antiquity, of some of the machine tools and equipment that I would find, especially in some of the smaller British factories. And, you know, I don't want to compare like with like. I've only been to a very small, unrepresentative number of Russian factories, and they've tended to be very big as well, by the way. But I would also confirm something else which he said, which is that Russian factories are very difficult to judge from the outside. They can look, when you travel to them, you see the buildings, and they can look very run down and poorly maintained. And then you actually enter the workshops inside, and you find that the work is actually well organized, that the machine tools are modern, and that the factories are clean. And by the way, both in Britain and elsewhere, I'd say that for me, the single clue that tells you about whether a factory is working well is how clean that factory is. If a factory is swept clean at the end of every day, that the shop floor is tidy, that the machine tools and the equipment have been put away in the right places, then that tells you that the work is well organised. And if, on the contrary, everything is dirty, there's litter lying around, there's bits of equipment lying around, well, that tells you the opposite. And for the record, as I said, I don't have huge experience, that level of experience of Russian factories. I regularly found that Russian factories looked to me well organised and tidy places, whereas the British factories that I used to visit once upon a time, a while back now, they didn't look like that at all. Maybe in Britain things have improved since I was doing that sort of thing. But I can easily believe that in the United States, in large parts of the US industrial economy that still functions, things are not good. The pictures that I saw of the one factory that apparently makes shells in the United States, I have to say, I thought were extremely unimpressive. Anyway, that's one point I wanted to make. The other is that we're now in a deepening political crisis in Germany. Chancellor Scholz has made an astonishing, defiant speech blaming the Russians for Germany's energy problems. He says that it's the Russians who cut off energy to Germany. That is an astonishing thing to say, an astonishingly brazen thing for him to say, given that it was he and his economics minister, Robert Habeck, who were working overtime, as I remember, to end what they liked to call Germany's energy dependence upon Russia by the end of 2022. I mean, I remember all of that vividly. But anyway, he said all of that. But he is also, even as he was making those astonishing claims at a conference of his SPD party, he was also declaring an economic state of emergency, essentially, in Germany, in order to enable the German government to extend, to widen the budget deficit. And this follows the German Constitutional Court's decision striking down the various devices and accounting ploys with which Chancellor Scholz has been funding various parts of the German economy and the German welfare system, even as tax revenues have been hit and costs have been rising by the pressures on Germany caused by the surge in energy costs. Anyway, this decision to increase the budget deficit is unpopular with Chancellor Scholz's coalition partner, the Free Democratic Party, whose leader, Christian Lindner, is the finance minister. The Free Democratic Party is now carrying out a poll of its members as to whether or not they will support this move of Chancellor Scholz. If they decide that they won't support the move, then I don't see how they can remain in the coalition, in which case the current German government will collapse. And that will open the way for one of two things: either a new election or possibly some kind of grand coalition arrangement between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, perhaps including the Greens, to avoid an election and to keep the funding for the war going. But one way or the other, the pressures in Germany appear to be increasing, and I wonder for how much longer they can hold. As I understand it, popular sentiment in Germany has now shifted significantly, and a plurality of Germans now want an end to the war. So, there we go. If that happens, of course, it won't just be the Americans and their lack of waning enthusiasm for the war that President Zelensky has to worry about, it will be the Germans as well. Now, this is where I end my discussion about the Ukraine crisis. There's been another very important development in the Middle East crisis, which is that yesterday the General Assembly passed another resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, I discussed in a recent program how Putin's trip to the Middle East about a week ago to the UAE and Saudi Arabia and his meeting with the Iranians was clearly part of a coordinated strategy in advance of the UAE's presentation to the Security Council of a draft resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. The United States found itself isolated and was the only country to vote against the resolution, which, because the United States has a veto, meant that the resolution in the Security Council failed. But I pointed out that it was undoubtedly the fact that the BRICS states were working together and were lobbying General Assembly members that explained why the number of states that co-sponsored the UAE's resolution to the Security Council numbered 97, which is a majority of UN member states. Well, yesterday, exactly as I anticipated, having failed in the Security Council, the next step to get a ceasefire resolution was made in the General Assembly, and it passed. Now, there's a number of things that need to be said about this resolution. The first is that we had a UN Security Council resolution previously from the UN on the 26th of October. That was the one that was proposed by Jordan. Now, 120 states voted in favour, 14 voted against, and 45 abstained. 120 voted in favour, 14 voted against, 45 abstained. That resolution, the one that was proposed in October, sought an immediate, durable and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. This latest resolution that has just passed the General Assembly was passed by 153 states. 153 states voted in favour, 10 voted against, including the United States again, obviously, Israel too, and 23 abstained. So you can see that the number of states who are supporting these resolutions is growing. 120 on the 26th of October, 153 on this occasion, with the resolution that passed yesterday. On the 26th of October, 14 states voted against the resolution. On this occasion, only 10 did. And going again back to the resolution that passed in October, on the 26th of October, 45 states abstained. This time, only 23 states abstained. The trend is clear. And the language of this resolution is harder than the resolution that the General Assembly passed in October. Now, the General Assembly resolution in October spoke about a immediate, durable and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. The latest General Assembly resolution, the one that has just passed, spoke about the General Assembly demanding an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The word ceasefire is in the resolution. The word that the United States, Britain, and the other Western countries have been straining every nerve to try to keep out of these UN resolutions. So we can see that the number of states who support these resolutions is growing, and that we've gone from a humanitarian truce or pause to a demand for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Now, again, this time, as was the case on the 26th of October, there were attempts by several states to try to amend the resolution to include criticisms, overt criticisms of Hamas, and again, those two attempts failed. So the resolution, whilst saying that it expressed grave concern for over the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and suffering of the Palestinian civilian population, and emphasizing that the Palestinian and Israeli civilian populations must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. So there is that there. And whilst also saying that all parties must comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, notably with regard to the protection of civilians, and whilst also calling for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, this resolution, again, does not specifically mention or condemn Hamas. So we can see the trend, and the reason for this trend is because of the continued Israeli offensive in Gaza and the humanitarian catastrophe that this is causing. The thousands of civilian deaths, one can argue about the numbers, but that we're talking about thousands of civilian deaths, including children, I think no one seriously disputes anymore. The enormous amount of destruction, and of course the terrible language that continues to come from some Israeli officials. So, unsurprisingly, President Biden has now warned Israel that this operation in Gaza is losing Israel support within the international community. What he really means, of course, is that it is losing Israel's support within the United States government. The Americans can see that the General Assembly is now edging ever closer to a position where it will make a mandatory resolution under the Uniting for Peace formula. I'm not saying we're there yet, but that's where we're gradually edging towards, and that there might also be referrals by the General Assembly to the ICC and such things. Now, I think this is big news. I'm going to discuss it further in my next programme. But I would like to make the point once more that, well, 2 points once more, that contrary to what many people think, this passage of resolutions, one after the other, through the United Nations, through the Security Council. We've now had, to my knowledge, two more resolutions from the General Assembly, successive draft resolutions, each becoming stronger in their language, put before the Security Council, is having the effect that the people who draft these resolutions intend. That it is coalescing global opinion against the United States and Israel and behind the Arab states and the BRICS. And it does matter. Eventually, the diplomatic pressure that we're seeing is going to become so strong that it is going to be all but impossible for the US to go on withstanding it. And the only reason why I personally think that we will not see things like General Assembly resolutions under the Uniting for Peace formula is because the United States, before that happens, will tell Israel to stop and might even support a resolution, a mandatory resolution by the Security Council itself. The Biden administration doesn't want to be put in that position, but that is where events are trending. Now, at the Duran, we've been saying this right from the beginning of this crisis, and you can see how things are playing out exactly as we said. Anyway, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop, buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. More from us soon, more from me soon, discussing no doubt further developments in the Middle East, further developments in Ukraine. In Ukraine, definitely, I think we're now in the end game. I think President Zelensky and some Ukrainians may be in denial about it. I think that in Washington, at least, everybody now understands it. This is where I end my program today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.